Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'supra divrei Torah. V'arivna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fivcha beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzeinu v'tze'etzeimcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodea shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma. Baruch atah Adonai hamlomei Torah l'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'cha banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Perfect. All right, guys, we're going to go through the laws in the Mishnah Berurah by Rabbi Daniel Brody. It's in the Shulchan Aruch section 172. Okay, so if one started eating before making a brocha, that's the subject matter. Now, if you started eating without making a full brocha, it depends. So if the food after spitting it out won't be disgusting, like hard food, one must take it out, one must do the full brocha, and then you may continue eating it again. But if the food after spitting it out will be disgusting, such as soft, juicy food, one must move it to the side of one's cheek and make a brocha on it. Okay. So I would suggest
hard food to the left as well.
Probably. I would suggest hard food to the left as well. Exactly. If one started eating a candy and then realized that you hadn't made a brocha yet, you should take the candy out your mouth and make a brocha of she'akoni bidvaro and then start eating again. But if one started eating grapes and then realized he hadn't made a brocha yet, he should swallow the grapes, make a brocha borei priya eitz, and then begin eating grapes again. So according to some poskim, it would be inappropriate to spit it out, such as in the front of people. Then one should move it to the side of one's mouth. Sometimes I don't know why you need the poskim to teach you the obvious. You want to go back for a meal. If you're starting to spit it out, you might not be invited back in such a hurry. But anyway, we dealt with drinking before making the bracha in the previous halacha. All right, now let's get to the Gemara. We're starting a new section of the same concept of the application. So what we're dealing with here is, now that we dealt with the mansion aspect, we're talking about a case of where it actually gets quite hectic. So before we were just talking about financial culpability. So what is financial culpability is that there's a difference in terms of full payment, half payment, whether you're negligent, whether you're obligated, and it has a limited application. Where it's going to get starting to get hectic is when you're liable to the death penalty versus payment of money. Now, Gavin, I don't know if you're up for it. Gav?
I might be. Let me see what you have to offer.
Okay, so when we learned in Sanhedrin, do you remember what that law was called? I can tell it to you, but I wanted to give you a clue. What happens is there's a principle that if you create an act simultaneously, in other words, a capital offense simultaneously while costing damage, the less severe penalty is waived in favor of the more severe penalty. So, for example, if you take a look at two capital cases that are not sequential, in other words, somebody is wanted for murder, idolatry, sexual immorality, and they're going to get the death penalty. You've got 4 different death penalties. You've got beheading, you've got stoning, you've got burning, and you've got you've got hanging, etc. And in those particular cases, there's a difference between the two different types of severity. You have Rav Yehuda basically says, as far as I remember, burning is the most severe, whereas the rabbis, I think, generally rule that stoning is the most severe. That was the argument in Sanhedrin. So what the issue is as follows, is that if you're having two death penalties, that can only kill you once. So what happens is, in order to ensure that there's a kapora for your neshama, they give you the most severe death penalty. Okay, so I'll tell you where we differ compared to the Western world, is why do you think we give the death penalty? There's multiple reasons. What do you think the distinct difference is? Guys, I'm asking you.
Sorry, I lost track for a second. Are you referring to the death penalty according to halacha? You're talking about?
Yeah, I'm saying there's a fundamental principle as to why we give the death penalty for capital offense, which differs to secular law. What concept do we have that differs slightly? Take a guess at it.
We love life.
No, but we do have places where they do that. We do have places where they give the death penalty as well. The only difference is with us is.
Yeah.
I'm saying
with us.
The primary difference with secular and halacha is with halacha is you get judged and then you got the flag story, which doesn't last long, and then you're out. That's it. I mean, there's no sitting in jail waiting.
Okay.
It's immediate.
Okay, so Gavin's bringing up one point that I never thought of. The psychological cruelty is very diminished. In other words, from trial to execution, you don't spend years having your nerves shot on appeal cases on death row, which could be psychologically far more traumatic. I mean, if any of you had ever gone to school where you were going to get caned and you were having to wait in the principal's office until they brought out the mighty cane and jacked you on the tuchus, you'll know that sometimes the wait was as bad as the caning. So that psychological looming of death over one's head is horrific. But that is a distinct difference. But the difference that I was talking, it's a good point, Gavin. The difference that I was talking about is that we're talking about the soul of the person that murdered. But Judaism is concerned with, what do you call it? Not revenge. It's a difference between revenge and vengeance. So vengeance, as to do the Hebrew term vengeance as opposed to revenge, is that you don't want to punish the person. What you want to do is for justice, meaning that if there is a wrong that is done, it needs to be rectified by spiritual means. So there's two things. There's that the person that has something taken from them would have to be repaid, and that the person that does the taking would have to have a spiritual repair. What do we mean by spiritual repair? Is that their soul would have to find some form of kapora to almost have a sort of spiritual healing. So what do we mean by spiritual healing? Is that if somebody commits the death penalty, they need to, guys, I'm hearing some sort of whistling in the background, and I don't know which computer it is that sort of works. Gab, and your screen's moving around every second.
Yeah, I'm trying to fix up my volume. I can't hear so well. Just give me carry on.
All right, I'm just getting giddy.
There's a drill. It might be a drill. Hold on, Damon. Just tell me if you.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So what I'm saying is as follows, is that if you have two different death penalties, according to secular law, what would happen is they would want to give the most lenient death penalty. Why? Because their goal is to have the death penalty as a deterrent to the masses. And therefore, the least severe death penalty would actually create that outcome. So in order to be merciful and kind to the person that committed murder, they would give him the least severe death penalty in order to use the death penalty as a deterrent whilst being, inverted commas, as kind as they can to that individual. They would also, as Gavin said, on death row to ensure that if there was any mitigating circumstances over a period of 2 decades, us, the taxpayer, would pay for a serial rapist or murderer while they're trying to find certain evidence to clear him. So I think there is a happy medium, is that the case has to have a due process and there has to be correct evidence, etc. But that waiting on death row is, I watched a CSI documentary where a guy was on death row for 14 years. He said he'd considered committing suicide many times on death row because the weight was killing him. The weight of what would happen. Now, the psychological trauma is immense. But the second aspect is the kapora aspect. What do we mean? If, according to Judaism, a person has to get a spiritual repair for creating murder, then you want to give them the most severe death penalty. Why? Because if they do not pay the right sort of death penalty, which would match that particular crime, how are they going to get spiritual exoneration? Does that make sense? In other words, every spiritual major error that would require the death penalty has a different death penalty, because that death penalty matches exactly the sort of spiritual rectification needed. And in addition to that spiritual rectification, that person has to do a full teshuvah. In other words, if you give somebody the death penalty and they have no regret whatsoever in terms of the behavior, that death penalty is not going to fulfill its purpose of kapora. It will fulfill its purpose of righting an injustice, but not working for that individual to help him basically pay the penalty in this world. There's two ways you pay the penalty, in this world or the next world. So the reason why we give a more severe death penalty, if they're two different death penalties that's owing to the person, is the more severe death penalty will cover both death penalties, so that the person has full spiritual exoneration. Does anybody have any questions? Guys?
No, it makes sense.
Okay. Marco, do you have any questions? Okay. So what we're saying here is this principle that we've got in the Gemara mimics it. So what is that principle? That principle is called basically kimle b'dirabba mine, which means that if you have two penalties, where you have a financial penalty and you have a death penalty that's caused by the same particular act, we basically remove the financial penalty aspect and then just concentrate on the death penalty. So you're only paying the more severe penalty, which under its umbrella covers any other penalties for the person. The downside is it would seem where that other person would lose out on financial restoration. So there's a whole argument in terms of the difference between what you call compensation and a financial penalty. So guys, can you tell me, Marco, what is the difference between compensation and a penalty?
Compensation is like the damage that was incurred, and a penalty is additional depending on the nature of the damage.
Good. So one of the principles that Marco said is correct is that if you cost me 100 zuz and you have to pay 150 zuz, the amount of that you have to pay doesn't match the penalty. Sorry, it doesn't match the amount that you damaged. It supersedes the amount that you damaged, which means that's an indicator that's a penalty that you pay, not the exact amount of damage, but more than you damage. That's correct. What are the two other aspects we learned?
Different multiples based on the type of
okay, so we learned we did learn that. I know what he's saying. He's saying when you stole an ox or a sheep, what you would have is you would have within that the compensatory amount. So when we say you pay 4 times as much for a sheep, the first amount is the compensatory amount. So in other words, if you stole 100 zuz worth of my sheep, you would pay the 100 zuz, plus you would pay an extra 300 zuz. So in total, you're paying me 400 zuz. So you pay me 4 times the amount, but the first time of repayment is actually the compensatory amount, and then times 3, which is the penalty amount. If it is a cow, it's times 5, which is one amount, the actual compensatory amount, and 4 times the penalty amount. And then for theft, you pay double. So if you took 100 zuz, you pay 200 zuz. Now, one of the reasons for that penalty is what you call a deterrent factor, meaning that if you stole from me, and the worst is you'd have to pay what you stole from me, why not take a chance? Why not take a chance? Guys, if you were going to take 200 zuz, and the worst is the court would make you pay me back 200 zuz, it's a win-win game. If you're not thinking like a spiritual person, why is it a win-win game? Because the worst is you'd have to pay back what you stole. You might end up getting away with it in this world. And if you were focused on this sort of world, you would need that deterrent of having to pay back far more than you took. So that was the one mechanism of the penalty. The other characteristic of the penalties, there's a third characteristic. What is that, guys? We learned it. A fixed amount. A kanas, a mammon is a compensation. It mimics the damage you caused. A kanas, a penalty, is a fixed amount. So what we're going to learn is a case of a Canaanite slave, that if you kill him, if a person kills a Canaanite slave, you have to, you're liable to that person is liable to the death penalty, because you're killing a human being. Doesn't matter if he's a slave, he's a human being. So there you're liable, not you, I'm saying a person is liable to the death penalty. However, if one's property kills a Canaanite slave, you're liable to 30 silver shekels. Remember that, 30 silver shekels is a penalty. If your ox gores a Canaanite slave and kills it, 30 silver shekel pieces. Do you remember we learned that?
Yeah.
So that is determined as a knas. Why is it determined as a penalty? Because even as Rashi said, if the slave is worth one mammon, one zuz, then you still have to pay 30 silver shekel pieces. Does that make sense? So then we're not determining what the slave is worth. We have a knas, a penalty, which is a set payment. Okay? And in that particular case, if that's by your property, if it's a person is liable to the death penalty. So the reason I'm saying this, and by your own admission, if you admit to the crime before troubling the courts and say, I did wrong, I stole, etc., then they cannot make you make the penalty. You just pay back the compensatory amount, but not the penalty amount. So that if you took 100 zuz and you trouble the court, you have to pay back 200 zuz. 100 zuz for the amount, and then another 100 zuz for the penalty. But if you went to the court and said, listen, I feel bad, I did wrong, you only have to pay back what you took. So by your own admittance, you don't have to pay the kanas, the penalty. How does this relate to this stuff? On two aspects, what we're about to do. We're going to learn about fire and the property. So if we say that a fire kills a slave, okay, that a person set, according to Reish Lakish, who deems the fire a person's property, you have to pay 30 silver shekel pieces. Does that make sense? And according to Rav Yochanan, who says that it's basically a person's fault, Michael, it's a person's arrows, and he set the fire alight, and he doesn't believe that it has to be direct contact on the slave itself, like Reish Lakish. He would then deem that that person that set alight the slave, if the slave couldn't escape, is liable to the death penalty. Now this law is going to have very serious implications, because the one would have to pay 30 silver shekel pieces, and the other one would have to be liable to the death penalty. Because if you say it's your property that killed the slave, just like it's your ox that killed the slave, you're liable to 30 shekel pieces. And Reish Lakish says that fire is one's property. If you deem fire as one's arrows or one's own force, then for force that a person generates, if a person hits another person or throws a stone and kills another person, he is liable to the death penalty. So now it really plays out in a very serious way, how you define these things. Does that make sense? Now, what about this law, Kim Leiber di Rabba Minay? What we're saying here is that you cannot make a financial payment as well as that person suffer the death penalty, because you only pay the more severe case if it's caused simultaneously by the same act. So in other words, if you set alight a barn, for example, on Shabbos with witnesses and with warnings, and you were warned, etc., you get the liability for purposefully breaking the Shabbos after you were warned, etc. So he set alight a Picasso. Let's say he set alight a Picasso, but for breaking Shabbos with all the right warnings, etc., he's liable to the death penalty. He doesn't have to pay the 30 million for the Picasso because he broke Shabbos in the same act that the Picasso was burnt. So he would not have to pay the financial payment and the death penalty, because again, if there are two death penalties, we only give the more severe one. If there's a financial amount or a penalty and a death penalty, the financial amount, which is the lesser, is waived for the more severe. So this is the law Kimle B'di Rabba Minai, that the less severe by simultaneous act is waived in favor of the higher penalty, because that higher penalty makes a kapara for everything. Thing of that is, so on a serious note, is there's either going to be in this case an implication for paying the 30 silver shekels for the slave, if you hold according to Reish Lakish. We're going to see the case now. Or you're liable or a person is liable for the death penalty for killing the slave. In other words, if you want to deem it's your fire, it's the property that killed the slave, just like the ox killing a slave is 30 silver shekels. That's according to Reish Lakish. According to Rav Yochanan, it would be a person's arrows or a person that set it in motion directly, even though the fire obviously caught a light, but we're talking about where the slave was bound there. And therefore, in that particular act, he is liable to the death penalty, the person that caused the fire for killing another human being. So I actually understand Rav Yochanan. I'm really battling to understand Reish Lakish with this. Does that make sense? Because if you think about it, I mean, you're responsible under the hands of heaven. But it's, like I remember when I was learning Sanhedrin with Gavin, Gavin and Ian Shapiro had a whole rule book about how to get away with murder in this world. Is that anything that was drama, which means indirect death, means that you can't really give the person the death penalty in this world. So, for example, if I hire a hitman, then I'm responsible in Shemayim, but the hitman gets the death penalty in this world. Why? Because he knew murder was forbidden and he took the direct act for money in order to kill. So one could give the hitman the death penalty, but not the person that orchestrated it. So I have been battling with understanding this sort of concept. And I'm not questioning the Torah. It's just that if you were running, for example, like a RICO case, or you were running things in New York where you were the mayor or the attorney general, you would want to give the death penalty to the mafia boss that issues all the orders, because he directly doesn't want to get his hands dirty with homicide. Does that make sense? But who's the person that's actually issuing the death? Is the mafia boss. It's not the soldiers that go and do the killing on his behalf. Does that make sense? So I'm battling with that concept myself a little bit, and to understand why Reish Lakish would deem only 30 silver shekel pieces. I understand the concept is he sees fire as your property, and since it's your property, it's like your ox killing and it's only 30 silver shekel pieces, as opposed to the 30 silver shekel pieces being waived with Rav Yochanan, because that person is liable to the death penalty for killing another human being. All right, any thoughts on this before I go through the Gemara, or we can go through the Gemara tomorrow? Kevin, what time do you have to go?
In 7 minutes, 8:40.
Okay, all right, so let me read it out of the Gemara quickly. We've got 10 minutes left. And the reason I had to just give this forward is so that it makes a little bit more sense.
Well, Damon, sorry. Why did it bring the death penalty into this? Why was it? Is it just in terms of the penalty because you pay? It's not compensate because you're talking about knas. Is that why?
Yes, the reason, it's an excellent question. What Kevin's asking is, why did it bring a knas penalty payment instead of a mammon compensatory amount? Okay. So one of the reasons the classic is that for a slave that you kill, you pay 30 silver shekel pieces, irrespective of what the slave is worth. So generally, there's a whole argument in the Gemara in terms of if Kimle B'di Rabba Minai means that there's a compensatory amount at the same time as a capital offense was caused, is that waived? As far as I know, it is, but with the penalty for sure. But with a compensatory amount like a mammon, I think it is as well. But there might be one or two opinions that say to the contrary. So let's just read the case quickly. The Gemara challenges Reish Lakish from another source. Come learn a proof from the Mishnah. Okay? And this is a Mishnah in 61b, by the way. If one set fire to a stack of grain and there was a kid goat bound to the stack, and a slave was near it and they were burnt with it, the one who set fire is liable to pay for the kid goat in the stack. But he's obviously not liable to pay for the slave because the slave was not bound and therefore could escape. However, if the slave was bound to the stack and the kid goat was near it and they were burnt with it, he, the one who set the fire, is not liable to pay for the destruction of the stack and the kid because it results from his act of murder. Okay, so what this is actually saying is it's using this case of the slave who was bound to the stack couldn't escape from the flames. So to kill a Canaanite slave is a capital offense because this is in Shemot chapter 21 verse 20. So the arsonist is committed an act of murder by any incidental monetary liability, doesn't have to pay for the monetary liability because the rule is kimle b'di rabbi mineh, which means he stands liable to the penalty greater than the payment mentioned in the Gemara. So in other words, you only have to pay the greater penalty. So the death is known as a penalty. Why is the death known as a penalty? Because you're generally not going to bring the person back. Let me tell you why it's not considered compensation. A kills B. B is dead. A getting the death penalty doesn't compensate B's family because B doesn't get resurrected from the dead because A dies. Do you understand what I'm saying? If somebody murders somebody else, there's no ways that they get resurrected. So it's known as a penalty because it doesn't really provide compensation. It doesn't bring back the person's life. So this is an argument a lot of secular people have, is that it doesn't really serve any particular purpose in bringing back their loved one, which you can understand. It takes a deeper discussion to have this as a separate chat. But for now, that's why it's called a death penalty. So if you have a financial monetary liability, you're free from that if it's caused at the same time. Okay. So basically, the reason why it says in the Gemara, you're not liable to pay for the destruction of the stack and the kid goat or the slave of the 30 silver shekels is because it results from his act of murder. And therefore, because the arsonist is liable to the death penalty, he doesn't have to pay the financial payments because the financial destruction was caused at the same time and the same method that was used to murder the slave. Fine. So the Gemara explains its challenge now. So it says the second ruling of the Mishnah is understandable according to the one who says that one is liable for his fire on account of being deemed his arrows, which is Rav Yochanan, because it's for this very reason that he's not liable to pay for the damages in this case. Because we're saying if a person uses his arrows or his force to set the fire, that's why he's liable to the death penalty. It's not his property that created the death penalty. It's not like his ox killed the slave. He set fire to the grain to the stack of grain, and therefore he killed the slave because the slave was bound up. So it's direct death penalty. But according to the one who said that is liable on account for the fire being deemed his property, why is he not liable to pay damages? So it's saying that basically, if you want to hold according to Reish Lakish, he says that your fire is your property and you've got an obligation to prevent your property from creating damage, just like you'd look after your pit and your ox from damaging others. If you deem fire your property and therefore you never caused the fire directly from a legal sense, and you're not liable for murder, why are you not paying the financial damages? Because the only reason you're not paying the financial damages is because you're liable for murder. So if his bull had killed a slave, would he also not be liable to make the monetary payment of 30 silver shekels? The Gemara answers, Rav Shimon ben Lakish would say to you in his defense, with what case are we dealing with here in the Mishnah, where he set fire to the slave's very person? For in that case, he certainly committed an act of murder, and he therefore stands subject to the penalty greater than payment. Okay, so what it's saying is Reish Lakish has to answer the Gemara. We've got 3 minutes left. So if he has to answer this particular Mishnah, he has to answer with the exact wording of the Mishnah. So the Gemara is now asking in that Mishnah in 63b1, why is it saying that you're not liable to the monetary payment? How would Reish Lakish answer it, since Reish Lakish wouldn't say that he would say that he has to pay the monetary payment because it's his property, it's his fire that caused the damage. So in that case, Reish Lakish would answer, that's when the arsonist burnt the slave directly with flame, meaning that it wasn't indirect where he set fire to the stack of grain. So when a person kills another person with direct force, A hits B, then a person, that's more of a category of maveh. So if there's direct contact for anything that a person causes directly, there is that's considered not your property, that's considered you. So Reish Lakish would answer that Mishnah and said the reason he doesn't make financial payment is he is liable to the death penalty. But it's not because he set alight the stack of grain. It's because he burnt the slave directly being tied down. In other words, he poured petrol on him and set him alight. Let's put it like that. And it's in that reason that he created murder and therefore doesn't owe payment for damages. So what did we learn here? The same as the previous Mishnah, is that there has to be direct contact of the fire in order for there to be culpability, and not his arrows, meaning you set a fire in one place and it goes to another. And that being his property, now it has an implication that if it was not directly set where you set the slave alight, that it's not considered murder because it's as though your ox damaged or killed the slave, it's your property. So these are very serious implications in terms of differences of how they see the issue. All right.